The Big Bang was, in a sense, rather simple. You can write down a rather short recipe. From that, you could, in principle, if you had a powerful enough computer, work out what would happen and end up with something rather like our universe.
This is an invention of the British mathematician John Horton Conway, and it is called the game of life. The word game is a misleading term. There are no winners or losers. As Conway himself puts it, a no-player game. However, it does serve as an amazing simulation of the laws that our universe possibly could be governed by. Despite only having 4 simple rules, they can lead to some wacky animations, and some even self-replicating. Now, before we get into this, it would be a good idea to know how this game actually works. So without further ado, let's crack on with it. This game is set in an empty grid, which is usually infinite, but doesn't have to be. Each little box is called a cell, and can either be alive or dead. Now, here are the 4 main rules. If any live cell has fewer than 2 live neighbours, it dies, as if by underpopulation. If any live cell has exactly 2 or 3 live neighbours, it lives on to the next generation. If any live cell has more than 3 live neighbours, it dies as if by overpopulation. And finally, if any dead cell has exactly 3 live neighbours, then it becomes a live cell, as if by reproduction. With just 4 simple rules, it may be surprising to most people that such complex patterns can emerge. These patterns are usually split into 3 categories: still lives, oscillators, and spaceships. Still lives are the patterns which do not move or change, such as the block and the beehive. They are called still lives because, well, they are still and don't move. Oscillators, also known as blinkers, are patterns which do change shape, but do not actually move from their current spots. An example could be blinker or toad. And the final ones are spaceships. These are the patterns that actually move across the infinite grid, such as the glider and the lightweight spaceship. Spaceships can get pretty wild, to the point where they start breeding gliders as if it was some kind of factory. The amazing thing about the game of life is that it's impossible to predict whether a pattern will die off or not. There have been algorithms attempting to do this, but none have been successful. You could play out a seed for 1,000 generations and have it not die, for it's only to die at the 1,001st generation. There is no way to tell. This unpredictability was what led Conway to creating this in the first place. Conway was wondering whether a few simple rules can then lead to complex behaviour and patterns that can replicate. And then after trial and error, he finally got to where the game is now. One of the reasons why this game gets a lot of attention is that this game could be a good analogy of how the universe behaves. In the game of life, you see complex patterns and entities moving around the screen as if they are alive, but in reality, they are just either dead or living squares following 4 simple rules. The universe could also follow a similar pattern. On a large scale, we have living beings like humans, but look closer and you see that they're just cells. Look closer and you see molecules, then atoms, protons, and eventually quarks. Everything in the universe, from as complex as a human to as simple as a rock, is made out of these 16 elementary particles, which follow the 4 known laws of physics. Sound familiar, right? The quark is one of the smallest things known to man, but there is nothing to say that we might discover something even more small and more simple. The important thing about the game of life is that it shows that simple things can lead to the creation of even more complex things. Our universe may not have exactly the same rules as the game of life, but it still may be governed by fundamental laws that can then generate entities such as life. Another interesting analogy from the game of life is that the fundamental physics of the game differ from the chemistry per se. On the lowest level, you have either dead or living cells, but zoom out and you have gliders and blinkers. Zoom out even more and you have breeders and even logic gates. If you observe carefully, you can begin to point out some basic laws governing the game. Some laws, for example, are blocks never move, gliders move diagonally, and etc. But in reality, there is no such thing as movement in the game. It is only an abstract concept that you give to cells that can either be on or off. You might be wondering what this means about the free will of a living being, and that's not a bad question to ask. Before we answer this, let's first define the difference between predictable and determined. Predictable just means that something can be predicted, and determined means that an event caused another. Now, it can be safe to say that this game is 100% determined. It has been programmed, and the blocks cannot choose on their own whether they are alive or dead. Their state is caused by the state of its neighbours, like a chain of dominoes. But is it predictable? Like I said earlier in the video, there have been no algorithms capable of doing so. One could probably predict the states in X amount of generations if done laboriously on paper, but it is very difficult and you can't predict the states of a generation 2 generations to the future without knowing the state before it. So what does this mean for our universe? Well, we can probably agree that the universe is also determined. The past affects the future. But is it predictable? Even less so than a game of life. We can't even probably predict the behavior of 3 particles. We cannot predict the exact position and velocity of every atom in a system. That is too difficult. However, we can predict more high-level objects such as rocks. If a rock travels at 5 km per hour for 2 hours, it would have travelled 10 km. That is a fact. This is because, unlike predicting every single subatomic particle in the rock, we can abstractize them into one object, the rock. This makes it easier to predict, since we are dealing with basically one large analogy. This is like predicting the direction of a glider in the game of life. It is much easier than predicting the position of every living cell on the grid. So what does this mean for our sentience, you ask? Well, let's work our way backwards. First we have quarks, then protons, atoms, molecules, cells, tissue, organs, and finally the human. Uncertainty and complexity builds up with each level, making it harder and harder to predict. Although a human's behavior is likely to be determined, it is so unpredictable that it basically has its own free will. A good example would be a circle. Imagine a curve being free will, and the amount of size on a shape is its unpredictability. Humans are basically circles. They're not perfectly round, since that would be impossible, but they have so many goddamn sides that they practically are. Just like circles, humans probably do not have free will, but since they are so complex and unpredictable, it is easier to say that they do than not. So that concludes this video. Today we have learned about John Conway and his brilliant invention, the game of life. We also had a look at the implication this game has on the real world, and what it tells about the nature of our universe. This was one of my favourite topics, so I really enjoyed making this video. If you have enjoyed this video, remember to like this video, subscribe and hit the bell button so you get a notification for my next video. So with all that, peace out.